So before we get started with Azure DevOps, continuous integration and delivery, I wanted to show you this web page that you can navigate out to on the web. You can type in learn.microsoft and then simply put in Azure DevOps documentation, and it will provide you with this website that contains this particular page. And I wanted to show you this page because it has a wealth of information on topics that we've already covered and that we're planning to cover. It also contains documentation associated to the core Azure DevOps components or services, such as Azure boards, which we've obviously spent a lot of time on. Now, in this continuous integration section of the course, I want to help you to connect the dots between continuous integration and delivery and Azure boards. In addition to Azure repos, pipelines, and again, you can go out to this webpage and there's just a lot of information that you can review or read on your own, although I'll be covering a lot of this content as part of this section of the course. So let me get a little more granular in terms of the anatomies of Azure DevOps in relation to continuous integration and continuous delivery around automation. The first topic is going to be on the anatomy of an Azure repo or repositories in general, but specifically around Azure, Git, and GitHub. But I really want to focus on Azure repos, with Git being the underlying technology, the Azure repo or Azure DevOps in itself, and what it brings to enhance the use of Git within the ADO environment. The second lesson, I want to focus on branching. And then I want to jump into the anatomy of build pipeline, what makes up this pipeline, which is the first of two pipelines. I'll talk about those artifacts, as well as what are agents in terms of Microsoft-hosted agents versus self-hosted agents, and what relevance do they have associated to continuous integration and delivery. I'm also going to talk about the YAML file used to configure the automation for continuous integration and delivery. And then I'm going to move into the anatomy of a release pipeline. So that's the second pipeline. It's really one big pipeline, but there's the build component and then there's the release component, where we feed in the build artifact and it preps the application for deployment to a particular environment, such as production or staging environment, QA, UAT for user acceptance testing, etc. And then I want to connect the dots. And I'm going to do that through demonstrating an end-to-end build and release scenario. What I'd like to do is, I know you're probably laughing, compare creating an application using continuous integration to baking a cake. Well, I know there's those beginners out there that have no development background. I think it's important at least you understand how integration and delivery works in ADO from an automated fashion, and really just understanding the overall framework, even if it's using baking a cake analogy. It may help, it may not, but I'm going to try. So the first item here is developers will write and commit code to what we call a repository, or you will often hear me refer to a repository as a repo. And that starts with developers writing code and committing that code. And if I were to compare that to baking a cake, it would be like gathering or preparing the cake ingredients. So you know what you want to create. You've got all the ingredients. Maybe it's in your refrigerator or a pantry area where you store those ingredients that you're now going to take and actually mix them up and create cake batter. And then we move into the automated build process, which again compiles the code, takes the libraries, the code, the resources in order to create what's called an artifact, such as like putting the cake batter that you've mixed based on a recipe into an oven and allow that cake to bake in accordance to instructions provided. And then there's automated testing related to unit tests, integration tests, in order to verify that the code changes are correct, similar to testing the readiness of a cake by inserting a toothpick or other methods to check if the cake is done. So we want to test the code to make sure that it's right, as well as check the cake to make sure that it's done and not half-baked, if I could use that term. And then we want to package that compiled code as well as all of those dependencies associated to that application into a deployable package similar to like you remove the cake from the oven, you allow it to cool before further handling. So we get to the end of the process and now we're ready to deliver it to the customer. So the continuous delivery model is automating the deployment processes. We push those artifacts to staging or to a production environment, like applying the frosting or decorations to a cooled cake in order to prep it to serve to the customer. There's automating the release of the software to the users or customers, such as cutting and serving the slices of cake for that taste test. And then finally, there's monitoring the application once it's in production. You want to ensure that it functions correctly. You want to ensure that the partakers of the cake are satisfied, as this particular stakeholder looks to be satisfied with the cake. So that was just a quick analogy. I at least hope that for those that wanted to get an idea of the fundamentals at a very high level before we jump in, it kind of gives you something you can keep in your mind as we start to go through the various components that I just touched on. So why don't we go ahead now and jump into ADO and discuss the anatomy of an Azure repo.